Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Wright, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Austin Peay State University, where I teach in the Homeland Security concentration. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. Yes, it's true. I actually showed up for the conference, even though it's not here. I'm in Portugal. Wish you were here. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over the semantics argument between what is recidivism and what is reengagement. I think I personally am much more interested in what goes on, why those who are caught, who disengage from fighting for some period of time, why do they go back to fighting, or why do they go back to crime? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Personally, I'm not interested in a semantics argument. I just want to know how dangerous are those with previous experience in terrorism. How dangerous are they once they're released from prison or return to the fight? Okay, so why study jihadi reengagement or recidivism? Well, there have been in the U.S. well north of 500 convicted in terror-related prosecutions since 9/11. 200 plus of these have already been released, with many more to come. Similar numbers all over the UK and Europe, with thousands being convicted. Many of those, hundreds and soon to be in the thousands, will have been released. Now, when you take these numbers, like 500 released former jihadis, how likely are they to re-engage in violence? Well, similar studies of criminals on recidivism, that is, criminals who commit crimes, are caught, released, and then commit another crime, show that between 25% and 60% of criminals in the US recommit crimes after being released from prison. The rates are similar in the UK, Germany, Canada, Netherlands. However, very few studies have looked at specifically Salafi jihadi or Islamist terrorists in these same countries. Now, with the advent of ISIS, it's estimated that tens of thousands, upward of 40,000 foreigners made their way to Iraq and Syria and joined ISIS. You also combine that with groups people who are joining Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda, and the numbers are pretty big. Another worry here is that once they go to a war zone, some normal kid off the streets goes there, is taught important fighting skills, not only in small arms, but in, say, bomb making, for instance. Now, many of them die there. Some of them just end up staying. Some of them end up marrying a local and kind of blending in. But thousands have returned home. Others, of course, went on to other conflict zones, and today we find their presence in conflict zones like Afghanistan. So the question is do they pose a significant threat to their homelands or other countries? Are they more ideologically committed after their involvement with groups like ISIS? Do their skills that they learned in these war zones make them more dangerous than the average criminals? These are questions people are asking, including politicians. But people like myself and others in the academic community want to quantify this and try to figure this out. I think in the interest of time, I'll let you read the theoretical reasons why we should worry. The statistical reasons seen on your right-hand side, though, seem a little more compelling to me. So, for instance, one study showed that 25% of prisoners released from Guantanamo Bay later returned to the fight. Another study of terrorist leaders' own writings found that 61% of terrorist leaders re-engage once they're initially caught or convicted. And 60% of those engaged in the Palestinian conflict are later, and convicted ones, are later convicted on terror-related charges. And then even in the in the world outside of Islamist terror, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a survey found that 21% of men self-reported that after they were already caught, that they intend to return to the fight once they got out of prison. Anecdotally, of course, these are two of the most famous cases where in the first case, Usman Khan, who was out of prison and had successfully, quote unquote, undergone reform, killed again. He was actually at a meeting of reformed prisoners when he went out on the bridge and started killing people. And of course, the terrible, terrible incident in 2015 where 130 were killed. Many of the leaders of the attack were former ISIS members who had gone to Syria, came back, and killed once they came back. So, yes, there are cases where those who were previously engaged in terrorist activities came back and did a lot of harm. I've actually done two previous studies on terrorist recidivism here in the US. I looked at what I would think of as the worst. That is, these are only people who are convicted of being involved in an actual plot to kill people rather than being somehow peripherally involved. And of course, of all those who've been released from prison, that's only 31 in a 20-year, 30-year period. We only have two examples of re-engagement, those who were convicted and who later went on to kill. One of them was killed in multiple states, Ali Muhammad Brown. The other one was Elton Simpson. He only got probation in his first conviction. He tried to join Al-Shabaab. That is, he tried to leave the country to join Al-Shabaab to fight, was thwarted, got probation. When he got off probation, he got together with another guy. They went to an anti-Islam event. They opened fire. Unfortunately for them, well, but good for us, the guards were armed, and the only two people killed were the two assailants. By far the most comprehensive study of recidivism and re-engagement was done by Thomas Renard in 2020, and he looked at across all the previous studies of recidivism. And what did he find? He found that recidivism is much lower than people expected, that it's somewhere between 1 and maybe even on the high side, 7%. Now compare that to actual criminal recidivism rates, and it's very, very low, no matter what. As long as you're looking at these countries that are non-conflict countries or countries with very low levels of conflict, re-engagement and recidivism is very low, much lower than criminal recidivism and re-engagement. We have two different sets of claims going on here. One set of studies showing high rates of re-engagement, another set of studies showing very low rates of recidivism or re-engagement. What's going on here? Well, I think two things. Among those studies that show high rates of re-engagement, two things that stick out. One, they're studying leaders, and of course, you expect leaders to have higher re-engagement rates than, say, the foot soldier. And number two, they're in a conflict zone. Look at where they were studying: Palestine, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guantanamo Bay, mostly prisoners who came from Afghanistan. And when they're released, where'd they go? Back to Afghanistan. So that's what we're finding. What about these other countries? France, the UK, the US, Indonesia. Well, these are relatively stable societies with relatively stable governments and with a relatively robust, long-standing system of law enforcement or military enforcement that's able to deal with the problems locally. So even in the three countries that are a little bit higher than the other countries, say, 8%, 7%, 5%, these are countries that had at least low-level civil wars or low-level guerrilla warfare in Indonesia and Malaysia, or the same thing in Spain. Most of that data captured a time when ETA, the Basque separatists, were active, which of course they haven't been for the last 20 years. So what about the foreign fighters? Despite calls from both ISIS and Al-Qaeda to stay at home and fight at home, don't come join us over here, the vast majority of would-be jihadis want to leave their home countries and go to conflict zones. Heckhammer in 2011, this is prior to Syria, the Syrian war, found that the estimates are somewhere between a 3-to-1 or an 11-to-1 proportion of those wanting to go abroad than those staying home. In other words, for every 3 to 11 would-be jihadis who actually make the journey to conflict zones, only one stays put. That's a very large proportion. You know, when it's a 1 to 11 or 1 to 5 or whatever the actual number is in this estimate range, far more want to go abroad to fight than want to stay home. And even those who go abroad and come home, mostly when they come home, you know what they do? Nothing. They don't fight. And among the very few who do come home and decide to commit acts of terror once they've been abroad, generally speaking, except for a few outliers, a few cases which are spectacular and were terrible, they generally aren't as harmful as people would be inclined to believe. All right, to contextualize this one more time. The recidivism rate in non-combat zones is 2.9%. Now that's as opposed to 25% recidivism rate for normal criminals. The average re-engagement rate is somewhere between 21 to 60%. That's 10 times greater than re-engagement in non-combat zones. The re-engagement rate for those who go abroad and come back, it's nearly identical to that 3%, 2.9% recidivism rate. The takeaway here, the greatest predictor of jihadi re-engagement is where they are released. If they're released at home, very low chances of recidivism. If they're released back in a combat zone, very high rate of recidivism. So why is this? There could be many reasons, sociological reasons, psychological reasons. I'm sure that there are valid psychological, sociological reasons. I'm going to not focus on them. I think there's also an argument to be made that the norms hypothesis explains some of this. The norms hypothesis essentially says that when the higher the degree of legitimacy of an act of violence, the more likely it is to occur. And so the idea is essentially this, is that generally all societies have taboos on violence. Generally all societies also have exceptions to the rules where they say, you know what, you can't go punch someone in the face, but if someone comes and punches you in the face, you can defend yourself, okay? Similarly, many countries have just war theories. In the West, for instance, Grotius is an important just war theorist. However, in Islamic societies, there's also been a long-standing tradition of theorizing about just wars. And among just war theories, there are certain theories that there's a near consensus on, and there are other theories that are less consensual. That is, there's some theories, there's a lot of legitimacy attached to when fighting is justified, and there are other theories when there is much less consensus. The idea here then, is, under the norms hypothesis, is that theories of just war in which there's a near consensus, there'll probably be more people willing to fight. On the other hand, in areas that are more obscure, in areas where there's much less consensus and maybe it's a minority viewpoint, less people will be willing to fight in those things. For time's interest, I'm going to skip this whole thing about the caliphate. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over most of this, but it may come as a surprise to even people who've studied kind of radical Islamist thought, that even among radical Islamist theorists, very few of them condone civilian casualties, or at least the intentional killing of civilians. And they're like someone like Abdul Azam, who was one of the founders of Al-Qaeda, he wanted people to come to Afghanistan to fight. This is traditional just war theory. It's Muslims defending their lands in a defensive war against a non-Muslim invading army. So you would imagine that a lot more people would say, oh yeah, that's a legitimate reason to fight. People like Khattab, again, famous jihadi theorists, decry overtly the killing of civilians on purpose. So the norms hypothesis claims that ideologically inspired violence increases with the perceived legitimacy of the conflict. So here's a kind of list of how many Muslim scholars would view the most legitimate acts of violence, the most legitimate warfare, down to the least legitimate. So you might picture this as kind of an inverted pyramid with the top of this, the majority of people supporting, and at the bottom of the pyramid, very few supporters. The idea again here is that conventional defensive warfare against non-Muslim invaders is the most legitimate, where all the way at the bottom, even among those who justify the killing of civilians, it's usually in this kind of, if all other things fail, we tried regular warfare, we tried guerrilla warfare, we tried all these other things and it failed, and now we're desperate. And just like other terrorist groups around the world, secular terrorist groups, they tend to use the language of, we really don't want to kill civilians, but we have to. And so I think if put to the test, the norms theory holds up. One, it explains why would-be jihadis are far more interested in traveling abroad to fight in a war zone than to stay at home and kill. Two, it explains why so many more people have been convicted of terrorism-related offensive than have been involved in actual jihadi plots. So in the US, for instance, the typical conviction is for conspiracy to provide material support to terrorism. That is, they didn't actually do any terrorism, they just conspired to do the terrorism. And what type of terrorism did they plot to do? Not actual terrorism either. They conspired to give stuff, material support to the terrorists. Normally what this means is they conspired to travel abroad to join a terrorist organization. It also explains why even attacking at home, when attacking at home, the most common target is connected to the military. The most recognizable of these types of terrorists who target military-related targets would be Nidal Hasan, who was responsible for the Fort Hood, Texas shooting. He killed 13 and injured 30. He justified it by claiming that he was a soldier of Allah at war with the enemies of Islam. He was a soldier fighting in a war. Who would he target? People in the military. He actually put SOA, Soldier of Allah, on his business card, and here's a picture of a PowerPoint presentation he did. We're at SOA on there as well. Some lesser known examples. In 2009, Abdul Hakim Muhammad, even after going to Yemen to meet with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, when he got home, who did he target? He opened fire at a military recruiting station in North Little Rock, Arkansas, killing 1 and injuring 2. In 2015, Muhammad Abdul Aziz, who did he target in my home state of Tennessee? He targeted 2 military recruiting offices in Chattanooga, killing 5 and injuring 2 more. The most telling, of course, is Moner Abu Salah. He joined ISIS. Well, okay, let me put it differently. He went to Syria sometime in 2011, 2012. When he got to Syria, eventually he hooked up with ISIS. He was an ISIS fighter. He came home from Syria, a member of ISIS. When he got to Florida, what did he do? Nothing. He visited with his family for a few months. Then what did he do? He went back to Syria in ISIS, fighting for ISIS. He was the first known American suicide bomber, ISIS suicide bomber, and he killed himself in 2014. Where did he kill himself? In Syria. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? The major differences in terrorist re-engagement domestically versus in war-torn countries can best be explained by the norms hypothesis. That is, that fighting in an actual military unit, in an actual war against mostly military targets is seen as much more legitimate by far more people than killing civilians in one's own backyard. What this means for domestic terrorism, that it's mostly stochastic, that is, it's unpredictable, and it's rare. The vast majority of would-be Islamist terrorists want to go overseas to fight. It also tells us that public perceptions on why these jihadis fight and who they wish to kill is just vastly different than what the would-be jihadists say and do themselves. In their own eyes, they are warriors in a just cause. As such, very few of even the most radical Salafi jihadis have the will or the inclination to attack civilians in their home countries. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Please send me an email if you have any questions, and hope to see you in person next time. Thanks. Bye.